Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of northern Massachusetts. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The winter of 1914 brought more than just snow to the small industrial town of Millfield, Massachusetts. It brought with it a silence that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. The local newspaper, the Millfield Chronicle, reported what appeared to be a routine story on January 17th, the disappearance of Abigail Whitmore, a 32-year-old librarian who had failed to arrive at work for 3 consecutive days. What began as a simple missing persons case would eventually unravel into one of the most disturbing documented incidents in New England's history, one that would challenge the very foundations of rational thought and scientific understanding. The Millfield Chronicle's initial report described Abigail's disappearance in mundane terms, noting only that her absence was unusual for a woman of such reliable character. This understatement would prove to be the first of many attempts by local authorities to minimize what was happening in their town, perhaps out of fear that the truth would be too disturbing to acknowledge. According to interviews conducted years later with surviving residents, there was an unspoken agreement among town officials to keep certain details from becoming public knowledge. This silence, this deliberate obfuscation, would itself become part of the terrible legacy of the Whitmore case. Abigail Whitmore lived alone in a modest Victorian house on Maple Street, inherited from her parents who had passed away some years earlier. Neighbors described her as reserved but pleasant, a woman who kept to herself, but was always cordial in her interactions. She had worked at the Millfield Public Library for nearly a decade, known for her meticulous cataloging system and encyclopedic knowledge of the collection. According to library records, Abigail had recently been tasked with organizing a collection of rare texts donated by the estate of Dr. Harrison Pembroke, a controversial physicist whose theories on consciousness and matter had been largely dismissed by the scientific community of the time. The Pembroke collection, as it came to be known, consisted of 17 bound volumes of personal journals, 3 unpublished manuscripts on theoretical physics, and a collection of correspondence with scientists across Europe and America. Library acquisition records show that the collection had been rejected by larger institutions, including Harvard University and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, before being donated to the Millfield Library by Pembroke's only surviving relative, a nephew with no interest in his uncle's work. A notation in the margin of the acquisition record, written in what handwriting analysis would later confirm was Abigail's, reads simply, "They refused this knowledge. We should not make the same mistake." What makes this case particularly unsettling is not merely the circumstances of Abigail's disappearance, but the documented phenomena that preceded and followed it. According to statements given to local authorities by Wilhelmina Mercer, Abigail's closest colleague at the library, Abigail had been experiencing what she described as episodes of awareness in the weeks before she vanished. She would stop mid-sentence, staring at empty spaces in the room. Wilhelmina told Officer Franklin Pierce in her January 19th statement, "When I asked what was wrong, she would simply say that she thought she heard someone calling her name." Wilhelmina further noted that these episodes had increased in frequency after Abigail began cataloging the Pembroke collection. "She became obsessed with his theories," Wilhelmina stated. "She would stay after hours, reading his journals by lamplight. I once found her at dawn still sitting at her desk, having apparently worked through the night." When I expressed concern, she told me that time behaves differently when you understand its true nature. Now, I assumed she was simply overtired, but now I wonder. The weather in Millfield that January was uncharacteristically severe. Record low temperatures had caused the Millfield River to freeze solid, and heavy snowfall had left many of the outlying farms isolated for days at a time. Meteorological records from the Boston Weather Bureau note that the region experienced what they termed atmospheric anomalies throughout that month, including unusual patterns of barometric pressure and electromagnetic disturbances that affected telegraph communications. A report dated January 12, 1914, just 2 days before Abigail's disappearance, notes that instruments measuring atmospheric electricity have recorded values exceeding all previous measurements taken at this station. Whether these anomalies were connected to the events in Millfield remains a matter of speculation, but the coincidence of timing has been noted by researchers who have studied the case. It was against this backdrop of white silence that the search for Abigail began. Sheriff Montgomery Hayward organized a search party of 12 men who combed the area surrounding Abigail's home and the library. Their findings, or rather lack thereof, only deepened the mystery. No footprints were found in the snow around her home, despite the fact that fresh snow had fallen the night before she was reported missing. The search party followed standard procedures for a missing person, checking out buildings, questioning neighbors, and eventually expanding their search to the woods at the edge of town. What they found there, or rather, what they didn't find, would become the first of many inexplicable elements in the case. According to Sheriff Hayward's official report, the search party discovered a perfect circle in the snow approximately 50 yards into the woods, where the snow had melted down to bare earth. The circle was exactly 17 feet in diameter, and despite the freezing temperatures, the exposed soil was warm to the touch. No tracks led to or from this circle, and no explanation for its existence could be determined. This detail was omitted from the public report, but preserved in Sheriff Hayward's personal notes, discovered decades later in the attic of his granddaughter's home. Abigail's home showed no signs of forced entry or struggle. Her bed was made, her kitchen tidy. A half-finished cup of tea sat on her writing desk beside an open journal. The last entry, dated January 14, 1914, contained only a single line: "The sound is coming from inside the walls now." This cryptic statement would become the first of many inexplicable elements in what the sheriff's report would later term the Whitmore incident. Further investigation of Abigail's home revealed other subtle but disturbing anomalies. All of the clocks had stopped at precisely 3:33 a.m. A compass placed on her dining room table would spin continuously rather than pointing north. Most puzzling of all was the state of her bedroom mirror, which, according to Officer Pierce's report, appeared to reflect light at an angle inconsistent with its position relative to the windows. These details were documented, but left unexplained in the official record. Library records indicate that in the months prior to her disappearance, Abigail had been spending an unusual amount of time with the Pembroke collection. Dr. Harrison Pembroke had been a controversial figure in scientific circles during the 1890s, proposing theories that suggested human consciousness could affect the physical properties of matter. His work had been largely ridiculed and eventually forgotten after his death in 1905. Among his papers were journals detailing experiments that, according to the few who studied them, bordered on the unethical. What exactly Abigail discovered in these papers remains unknown, but her colleague Wilhelmina reported that Abigail had become obsessed with certain passages, copying them meticulously into her own notebooks. One such notebook was found in Abigail's desk at the library, containing what appeared to be complex mathematical equations interspersed with cryptic notation such as boundary threshold determined by observer consciousness and perception creates reality only until it doesn't. A physics professor from Boston University, consulted by researchers in 1952, would later describe these equations as remarkably similar to aspects of quantum theory that would not be formally proposed until decades later. As the search for Abigail continued without success, strange occurrences began to be reported around Millfield. Conrad Thorne, who owned the general store across from the library, gave a sworn statement to Sheriff Hayward on January 22nd, claiming that he had seen lights moving inside the closed library late at night, like someone carrying a lantern from shelf to shelf, but more fluid-like, not steady like a normal light would be. When the sheriff investigated the next morning, the library was locked and undisturbed, though he noted in his report that several books from the Pembroke collection had been moved from their shelves and placed in a circular arrangement on the reading room floor. The books were open to pages containing similar diagrams, concentric circles with mathematical notations that, according to Wilhelmina Mercer, resembled the organizational system Abigail had been developing for the collection. Photographed before being returned to their proper places, these diagrams would later be compared to similar arrangements found in ancient astronomical texts, though the significance of this comparison remains debated among researchers. The people of Millfield were practical folk, hardened by the harsh New England winters and the demanding work of the textile mills that were the town's economic backbone. They were not prone to fanciful thinking or superstition. Yet as January gave way to February, an uneasiness settled over the town. People reported hearing whispers in empty rooms, seeing movements at the corners of their vision that vanished when directly observed. Dr. Solomon Waite, the town physician, noted an increase in patients complaining of insomnia and feelings of being watched. In his medical log from February 1914, he wrote, "There seems to be a nervous condition spreading through Millfield. Patients describe identical symptoms without having discussed them with one another, most disturbing." His clinical notes detail reports of patients hearing their names called by voices that sounded almost but not quite human, experiencing sudden drops in temperature in specific areas of their homes, and most commonly, feeling an inexplicable sense of dread when alone. Dr. Waite initially attributed these symptoms to anxiety caused by Abigail's disappearance and the harsh winter conditions. But as the reports increased in number and similarity, he began to consider other explanations. On February 7, 1914, 21 days after Abigail's disappearance, Sheriff Hayward received a telegram from the police department in Arkham, a town some 30 miles north of Millfield. A woman matching Abigail's description had been found wandering along the banks of the Miskatonic River, disoriented and suffering from exposure. When brought to the Arkham Hospital, she had identified herself as Abigail Whitmore of Millfield. Sheriff Hayward and Dr. Waite immediately traveled to Arkham to confirm her identity and bring her home. The Arkham police report describes the circumstances of Abigail's discovery in clinical terms, noting that she was found by a local fisherman, Sebastian Marsh, who initially mistook her for a ghost due to her pale appearance and the white nightgown she wore despite the freezing temperatures. Marsh's statement, included in the police report, describes how Abigail appeared to be walking in a straight line, as if following something only she could see. When he called out to her, she allegedly turned to him and asked, "Are you real, or are you one of them?" before collapsing from exhaustion. The woman was indeed Abigail Whitmore, but according to Dr. Waite's medical assessment, she was profoundly changed. His notes, preserved in the Millfield Historical Society archives, describe her as physically identical to Miss Whitmore, yet somehow fundamentally altered. She was severely malnourished and exhibited signs of prolonged exposure to the elements, despite the fact that no one could explain how she had traveled to Arkham through the deep snow without appropriate clothing or supplies. More disturbing were the perfectly symmetrical bruises on her temples and the backs of her hands, which Dr. Waite described as similar to electrical burns, but with a pattern I have never before encountered in medical literature. These marks, photographed as part of Dr. Waite's examination, formed precise geometric patterns that one consulting physician compared to circuit diagrams for some unknown device. Most disturbing of all was a small area at the base of Abigail's skull where her hair had turned completely white, forming a perfect circle approximately 1 inch in diameter. When touched, this area was reportedly several degrees colder than the surrounding skin, a phenomenon that Dr. Waite could not explain through any known medical condition. Abigail herself could provide no explanation for where she had been or what had happened to her. When questioned, she would stare blankly and speak in what Sheriff Hayward described as circles of logic that led nowhere. The only consistent statement she would make was that the boundaries are thinner than we think. When asked to elaborate, she would become agitated and repeat phrases from Pembroke's journals, according to Wilhelmina, who visited her at the Arkham Hospital. One particularly troubling incident, documented by a nurse at the hospital, occurred during Wilhelmina's visit. According to the nurse's notes, Abigail suddenly grabbed Wilhelmina's hand and said, "They're watching us through the spaces where reality doesn't quite connect." Pembroke found the gaps. "I've seen through them now." She then accurately described events that had occurred in Millfield during her absence, details she could not possibly have known through normal means. When Wilhelmina, shaken by this experience, asked how Abigail could know these things, Abigail reportedly smiled and said, "Distance is an illusion we create to make existence bearable." Upon Abigail's return to Millfield, Sheriff Hayward hoped that the strange occurrences in town would subside. Instead, they intensified. The records from this period are fragmentary, as if those documenting the events were reluctant to commit certain details to paper. What can be pieced together suggests that Abigail's presence seemed to amplify the unexplained phenomena. Objects would move when she entered a room. Clocks would stop. People reported hearing her voice when she wasn't speaking. Most disturbing were the accounts of those who spent prolonged periods in her company. They described experiencing brief moments of what one witness called slippage, where familiar surroundings would momentarily appear distorted or unfamiliar, as if seeing a different version of the same place overlaid on reality. These episodes were typically accompanied by a sensation of extreme cold and the impression of whispered voices just below the threshold of comprehension. Sheriff Hayward, initially skeptical of these reports, experienced such an episode himself while interviewing Abigail about her disappearance. In his personal journal, he described looking out the window of Abigail's home and momentarily seeing Millfield as a place both familiar and terribly wrong, as if I was seeing what our town might become in some nightmarish future. Dr. Waite, initially skeptical of these reports, began to observe Abigail more closely. In a letter to a colleague at Boston Medical School, dated February 18, 1914, he wrote, "I have witnessed something today that I cannot explain through any medical or scientific framework at my disposal." While conducting a routine examination of Miss Whitmore, the glass of water on my desk began to vibrate in perfect synchronization with her pulse. When I moved the glass, it resumed this vibration regardless of its new position. Most disturbing was Miss Whitmore's reaction, or lack thereof. She simply nodded as if confirming something she already knew. Dr. Waite's letter continues to describe other anomalies he observed, including the behavior of his pocket watch, which ran backward in Abigail's presence, and the inexplicable failure of his gas lamps, which would dim when she spoke certain phrases. He concludes his letter with a request for his colleague to consult specific texts on neurological conditions that might explain Abigail's symptoms, though he admits that, "I fear we may be confronting something beyond the current boundaries of medical science." Fine. By late February, Abigail had been moved to her home on Maple Street under the care of a nurse hired by the town council. Josephine Blackwood, a no-nonsense woman with 15 years of nursing experience, kept detailed notes of her time with Abigail. These notes, discovered decades later during a renovation of the house, provide some of the most compelling documentation of the case. According to Nurse Blackwood, Abigail would spend hours staring at blank walls, sometimes pressing her ear against them as if listening. She would write complex mathematical equations that made no sense to Nurse Blackwood, covering pages with numbers and symbols before burning them in the fireplace. On several occasions, Nurse Blackwood reported finding Abigail in rooms that had been locked from the outside, with no explanation for how she had entered. Most disturbing was Abigail's apparent ability to predict specific events before they occurred, from changes in the weather to unexpected visitors. Nurse Blackwood, a woman with no interest in the supernatural or paranormal, struggled to maintain her professional detachment in the face of these inexplicable occurrences. Her notes reflect an increasing anxiety as February progressed, with entries becoming shorter and more clinical, as if she were attempting to distance herself from the disturbing reality of her patient's condition. Most unsettling were the records of Abigail's sleep patterns. Nurse Blackwood noted that Abigail would fall into deep sleep precisely at midnight each night, regardless of her activities beforehand. During these periods of sleep, her breathing would become so shallow that Nurse Blackwood would sometimes fear she had passed away. Yet at precisely 3:33 a.m., Abigail would suddenly sit upright in bed, eyes wide open, and speak in what Nurse Blackwood described as a voice not entirely her own. These nocturnal utterances were recorded faithfully in the nurse's journal, though many entries note that the words made little sense to her. The transcriptions reveal phrases such as, "The observers create the observed," and "When enough minds perceive the same reality, it calcifies into consensus." Most troubling were references to those who wait in the spaces between, entities that Abigail claimed were neither alive nor dead in any sense we would understand, but conscious in ways we cannot comprehend. On several occasions, Abigail spoke of these entities as if they were present in the room, addressing questions or responses to empty corners where, according to Nurse Blackwood's notes, the shadows seemed somehow deeper than they should have been. One such entry, dated February 24th, reads, "Patient awakened at usual time, stated the following: The consciousness persists after dissolution of the vessel. Pembroke was correct. They are watching from the spaces between perception." When questioned about these statements in the morning, patient had no recollection of speaking. This pattern continued night after night, with Abigail's nocturnal pronouncements becoming increasingly specific and disturbing. On February 27th, she reportedly sat upright at the usual time and said, "They are preparing to come through. The boundaries are weakening. Pembroke calculated the convergence for March 3rd. The alignment will open the way." When Nurse Blackwood attempted to press for clarification the next morning, Abigail had no memory of the statement, but became unusually agitated, insisting that she needed to return to the library to complete the arrangement. Nurse Blackwood, following Dr. Waite's instructions to keep Abigail calm and confined to her home, refused this request, leading to what she described as a demonstration of strength far beyond what Miss Whitmore's physical condition should allow. It took the combined efforts of Nurse Blackwood and a neighbor to restrain Abigail, who reportedly continued to insist that it must be completed or they will come through wrong. The situation came to a head in early March 1914. According to town records, on the night of March 3rd, every clock in Millfield reportedly stopped at 3:33 a.m. Residents awoke to find their timepieces frozen at the same moment, an occurrence that the Millfield Chronicle attributed to an unexpected electrical disturbance, possibly related to unusual aurora activity. However, telegraph records from the railroad station indicate that the station master sent an urgent message to Boston describing the event as beyond any natural explanation. The message, preserved in railroad archives, goes on to describe how all electrical and mechanical devices in Millfield malfunctioned simultaneously. how compass needles spun wildly before pointing toward Abigail Whitmore's house on Maple Street, and how every dog in town howled continuously for precisely 33 minutes. These details were omitted from official reports, but personal diaries and letters from Millfield residents confirm that something extraordinary occurred that night. Multiple witnesses described seeing unusual lights in the sky above the town, not the familiar aurora, but what one account called ribbons of luminescence that seemed to pour downward like water, converging on a point near the east end of town, the location of Abigail's home. That same night, Nurse Blackwood made her final entry regarding Abigail Whitmore. The handwriting, normally neat and precise, becomes increasingly erratic as the entry progresses. Patient extremely agitated this evening keeps repeating that they're coming through, but will not specify who they are. Refuses sedation, 11:45 p.m. Patient now calm, but insists on sitting by the east window, staring at the night sky. Says she is waiting for the alignment. Midnight. Patient has fallen asleep in chair. Will attempt to move her to bed. 3:30 a.m. Awakened by sound from patient's room. Door appears to be stuck. Can hear patient speaking but cannot make out words. Room has grown inexplicably cold. Will attempt to force door. The entry ends abruptly, the pen trailing off mid-sentence. Forensic analysis of the journal in 1952 revealed traces of frost on this page, despite the fact that the journal had been kept in a heated storage room for decades. How this frost formed, or how it persisted over time, has never been satisfactorily explained. The next morning, according to Sheriff Hayward's report, Nurse Blackwood was found unconscious outside Abigail's bedroom door, suffering from what Dr. Waite diagnosed as severe hypothermia, despite the fact that the house was adequately heated. When she regained consciousness, Nurse Blackwood could recall nothing after attempting to open the bedroom door. Most alarming was her physical condition. Her hair, previously dark brown, had turned completely white, and an ophthalmological examination revealed unusual damage to her retinas consistent with exposure to extreme brightness, according to Dr. Waite's assessment. When questioned about what she had seen or heard, Nurse Blackwood became extremely agitated, speaking in fragmented sentences about figures that weren't right and light that came from everywhere and nowhere. To Bow Doctor, Waite ultimately sedated her to prevent what he termed a complete nervous collapse. She was transferred to the Massachusetts State Hospital in Boston, where she remained for several months before being released. Hospital records indicate that she never fully recovered from her experience, suffering from recurring nightmares and an intense phobia of darkness for the remainder of her life. She never returned to nursing and refused to discuss the events of that night, even decades later when approached by researchers investigating the Whitmore case. As for Abigail Whitmore, she had vanished once again. The bedroom window was found open, though snow on the ground outside showed no footprints leading away from the house. The room itself was in perfect order, with no signs of struggle or hasty departure. The only anomaly was the temperature, which remained unusually cold for several days, despite efforts to heat the space. Most disturbing was the condition of the bedroom mirror, which, according to Sheriff Hayward's report, had changed in some fundamental way that defies explanation. The report describes how the mirror still functioned as a reflective surface, but the reflections it showed were subtly wrong. Colors were slightly shifted, movements were delayed by fractions of seconds, and objects at certain angles appeared distorted. When Dr. Waite attempted to examine the mirror more closely, he reportedly saw a reflection that did not match his movements, an experience that left him so shaken that he ordered the mirror to be covered and removed from the house. It was eventually stored in the basement of the town hall, where it remained until a fire in 1926 destroyed most of the building's contents. The second search for Abigail yielded no results. Sheriff Hayward's report notes that Given the previous pattern of behavior exhibited by Miss Whitmore, and considering her deteriorated mental state, it is presumed that she wandered into the surrounding wilderness and succumbed to the elements. The case was officially closed on March 17, 1914. This conclusion was perhaps convenient for town officials eager to put the disturbing events behind them, but it did little to explain the anomalies associated with Abigail's disappearance or the continuing phenomena that would plague Millfield in the months that followed. It is worth noting that Sheriff Hayward resigned his position shortly after closing the case, moving his family to Vermont and reportedly refusing to discuss Millfield or the Whitmore incident for the remainder of his life. His successor found the investigation files in disarray, with key documents missing and others heavily redacted, suggesting a deliberate attempt to obscure certain aspects of the case. However, the story of Abigail Whitmore does not end there. Throughout the spring and summer of 1914, residents of Millfield and neighboring towns reported brief sightings of a woman matching Abigail's description, often in places where a person could not reasonably be, on rooftops, in abandoned buildings, or standing in the middle of the Millfield River. These sightings were dismissed by authorities as the product of overactive imaginations fueled by the mysterious circumstances of her disappearance. Yet the consistency of these reports, often from reliable witnesses with no connection to each other, suggests something more than mass hysteria. The description of the woman was always the same, dressed in white, unnaturally pale, with a small circle of white hair at the base of her skull. Most reported that she seemed to be looking for something, examining her surroundings with intense focus before vanishing when directly approached. Several witnesses claimed that she would speak to them, asking questions such as, "Is this the right one?" or making statements like, "This isn't where it happens yet." The meaning of these interactions was never clarified, as the woman would invariably disappear before further conversation could occur. More difficult to dismiss were the physical effects that sometimes accompanied these sightings. Ferdinand Müller, a German immigrant who worked as a watchman at the textile mill, gave a sworn statement claiming that the machinery in the mill began operating of its own accord late one night, after he saw a woman resembling Abigail walking between the looms. The incident was investigated by the mill owner, who attributed it to mechanical failure and the suggestible nature of an overtired mind. However, the mill's maintenance records from the following day note that several of the machines had been modified in ways that the mechanics could not explain, with gears rearranged in configurations that should not have been functional but somehow were. These modifications reportedly increased the efficiency of the machines by nearly 30%, an improvement that the mill owner quietly accepted without further investigation. Similar incidents occurred at other locations in Millfield. The telegraph office reported that their equipment spontaneously transmitted a series of mathematical equations identical to those found in Abigail's notebooks. The town clock began running backward for exactly 33 minutes before correcting itself. Electric lights throughout the town would dim momentarily when certain names were spoken, particularly that of Harrison Pembroke. By the autumn of 1914, the frequency of these sightings had decreased, and life in Millfield began to return to normal. The Pembroke collection was removed from the library and transferred to the archives at Miskatonic University in Arkham, where it was placed in restricted storage. Abigail's house on Maple Street remained empty, as no one in town was willing to purchase or rent it. According to land records, it was eventually sold in 1920 to an out-of-state buyer who never took up residence. The house itself became something of a local legend, with children daring each other to approach it on Halloween and adults crossing the street to avoid walking directly past it. Over time, the acute fear associated with the Whitmore incident faded into a general uneasiness, a collective agreement among Millfield residents not to discuss certain events or ask certain questions. This deliberate forgetting might have been successful had it not been for the persistent efforts of one man to understand what had truly happened. The case might have faded into obscurity were it not for Dr. Solomon Waite. Troubled by what he had witnessed and unable to reconcile it with his scientific understanding of the world, Dr. Waite began a personal investigation into both Abigail Whitmore and Harrison Pembroke. His findings, compiled in a private journal discovered after his death in 1932, suggest connections far more disturbing than those acknowledged in official records. Dr. Waite approached his investigation with the methodical precision of a scientist, corresponding with colleagues at major universities, consulting obscure texts on theoretical physics, and even traveling to locations associated with Pembroke's earlier work. His journal documents a gradually expanding understanding of what he came to believe was happening in Millfield, a theory so radical that he hesitated to share it even in his private writings. The early entries reflect skepticism and a determination to find rational explanations for the phenomena he had witnessed. Later entries reveal a man grappling with evidence that challenged his fundamental understanding of reality. The final pages contain what he termed a hypothesis that I hesitate to commit to paper, for fear that the very act of articulating it might somehow make it more real. Dr. Waite's journal reveals that Harrison Pembroke had conducted experiments involving electrical stimulation of the brain and exposure to certain frequencies of sound and light, which he believed could alter human perception and potentially allow consciousness to perceive what he termed adjacent realities. More troubling was Dr. Waite's discovery that Pembroke had specifically sought test subjects who possessed certain rare neurological traits that, according to medical records, Abigail Whitmore exhibited. These traits included a condition called synesthesia, where sensory pathways in the brain are cross-wired, causing one type of sensory input to trigger another, such as seeing sounds or tasting colors. Pembroke had theorized that individuals with such neurological variations might be more receptive to perceiving what he called the spaces between conventional reality. His journals, according to Dr. Waite's notes, contained detailed accounts of experiments with volunteer subjects, many of whom reported disturbing sensory experiences and psychological after effects. Most concerning was Pembroke's final series of experiments, conducted in isolation at his rural Massachusetts home in the year before his death. These experiments, detailed in journals that had not been included in the collection donated to Millfield Library, involved attempts to not merely perceive but interact with these adjacent realities. The final entries in these journals, recovered by Dr. Waite through correspondence with Pembroke's nephew, contained references to successful bidirectional communication and entities that exist in the interstices of conventional space-time. In 1915, Dr. Waite traveled to Arkham to examine the Pembroke collection. His journal entries from this period express increasing alarm at what he found. Pembroke was not merely theorizing. He had achieved results. The calculations in his later journals suggest he had found a method to thin the membrane between states of reality. Most disturbing is his final entry, which reads simply, "The door opens both ways." Dr. Waite's examination of the collection revealed aspects that had been overlooked during its time in Millfield. Marginal notes in Pembroke's journals contained references to astronomical alignments and geological locations where he believed the boundary between realities was naturally thinner. One such location, described in detailed notes and accompanied by survey maps, corresponded precisely to the area in Millfield where Abigail's house stood. According to Pembroke's calculations, this location experienced periodic convergences, during which the boundary became particularly permeable. The next such convergence, based on his mathematical model, would have occurred on March 3, 1914, the night of Abigail's second disappearance. Dr. Waite's investigation led him to other cases similar to Abigail's. Individuals who had experienced unexplained disappearances followed by returns marked by profound psychological changes and accompanied by localized physical anomalies. These cases spanned decades and occurred across New England, though none were as well documented as Abigail. What connected them, according to Dr. Waite, was their association with locations where Pembroke had conducted his experiments. In each case, the affected individual had displayed neurological traits similar to Abigail's, and in each case, their disappearance and return had been accompanied by unexplained phenomena affecting the surrounding area. Most disturbing were the long-term outcomes of these cases. Without exception, the individuals eventually vanished again, typically during astronomical alignments similar to those Pembroke had identified as significant. And in each case, sightings of the missing person continued for years afterward, often in locations far from where they had last been seen, and without any apparent aging or physical change. In 1917, Dr. Waite published a paper in an obscure medical journal suggesting that certain individuals might possess neurological structures that made them sensitive to stimuli, imperceptible to others. The paper was largely ignored by the medical community, and Dr. Waite did not publish on the subject again. His private journals, however, tell a different story. He continued his research in secret, increasingly convinced that Pembroke had discovered something genuine, if dangerous. His investigations led him to ancient texts describing similar phenomena across cultures and throughout history, accounts of individuals who disappeared and returned changed, who reported experiences in realms beyond normal perception, who brought back knowledge they could not possibly have acquired through conventional means. What had been dismissed as mythology or superstition began to take on new significance in light of Pembroke's work and the events in Millfield. Dr. Waite came to believe that what Pembroke had discovered through scientific inquiry had been glimpsed by others throughout human history, though interpreted through the cultural and religious frameworks of their times. The underlying reality, he suggested in his private writings, was that human consciousness was capable of perceiving and potentially traversing boundaries between different states of reality under certain conditions that Pembroke had learned to create artificially, but that sometimes occurred naturally in specific locations during specific astronomical alignments. The final entries in Dr. Waite's journal from late 1931 become increasingly paranoid. He writes of being watched, of hearing whispers when alone, of seeing movement at the edges of his vision. He describes returning to Millfield, now a town in decline as the textile industry moved south, and finding that residents still refused to discuss the Whitmore case even 17 years later. Most disturbing are his accounts of visiting Abigail's former home, now abandoned and falling into disrepair, and experiencing phenomena similar to those reported in 1914, sudden drops in temperature, the sensation of being observed, and momentary perceptions of something else overlaid on conventional reality. In his last entry, dated December 28, 1931, he wrote, "I have seen her again, standing across the street in the snow, looking directly at my window. It has been 17 years, but she has not aged a day. This will be my final entry, as I now understand what happened to Abigail Whitmore. The human mind cannot comprehend certain realities without being fundamentally altered by them." Pembroke opened a door, and Abigail walked through it, but something else walked back. The entry ends with a hastily scrawled note. "She is coming to the door now. I will ask her what she has seen." Dr. Waite was found dead in his home on January 2, 1932. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, though the attending physician noted unusual conditions similar to extreme frostbite on Dr. Waite's hands and face, despite the fact that his home was well heated and he had not been outdoors. More disturbing were the conditions of the room where his body was discovered. According to the police report, every reflective surface, mirrors, windows, even the polished surface of his desk, had been covered with cloth. His journal lay open on his desk, the final entry visible. But the pen had fallen to the floor as if dropped suddenly. Most puzzling of all was the condition of his pocket watch, a prized possession he had carried for decades. When found, the watch was running backward, and the glass covering its face had frosted over from the inside. These details were recorded but not explained in the official report, which attributed Dr. Waite's death to natural causes exacerbated by his age and the winter weather. No mention was made of his connection to the Whitmore case or his research into Pembroke's work, though his personal papers were confiscated by the Arkham Police Department and eventually transferred to Miskatonic University, where they remained in restricted storage alongside the Pembroke collection. The case of Abigail Whitmore remains officially unsolved. The events in Millfield during that winter of 1914 have been attributed to mass hysteria, environmental factors, or simply exaggeration over time. Yet certain details resist rational explanation. The simultaneous stopping of all timepieces in town was documented by multiple independent sources. The physical changes to both Nurse Blackwood and Dr. Waite were verified by medical professionals with no connection to the case. And the mathematical equations Abigail wrote, preserved in a few scraps that escaped burning, were analyzed by a physicist from MIT in 1952, who described them as advanced theoretical work on the nature of space-time decades ahead of contemporary understanding. This physicist, Dr. Lawrence Pritchard, became so intrigued by the Whitmore case that he devoted the final years of his career to studying it, eventually publishing a monograph titled Consciousness and Reality: The Pembroke Hypothesis Revisited. In this work, Pritchard suggested that Pembroke's theories, far from being the ravings of a pseudoscientist, as his contemporaries had believed, might have anticipated aspects of quantum physics that would not be formally proposed until the 1920s and 1930s. Specifically, Pembroke's notion that consciousness plays a role in determining the nature of reality bears striking similarities to the observer effect in quantum mechanics, where the act of measurement affects the system being measured. Pritchard went further, suggesting that Pembroke might have discovered practical applications of these principles decades before mainstream science even recognized their theoretical validity. Perhaps most unsettling are the reported sightings that have continued sporadically over the decades. In 1936, a woman matching Abigail's description was photographed in the background of a group portrait taken at the Millfield Library's centennial celebration. In 1947, the night watchman at Miskatonic University reported seeing a woman in outdated clothing examining the Pembroke collection, which by then had been sealed in storage for decades. As recently as 1963, a survey team mapping the area around the now abandoned town of Millfield reported a brief encounter with a woman in white who asked them about the progress of the experiment before walking into the forest and vanishing from sight. Each of these sightings shares common elements. The woman appears exactly as Abigail did in 1914, showing no signs of aging. She is described as speaking normally but saying things that make little sense to the listener. And her appearance is often accompanied by localized phenomena such as electrical disturbances, unusual cold, or the temporary malfunction of watches and compasses. These sightings typically cluster around specific dates that, when analyzed by researchers familiar with Pembroke's work, correspond to the astronomical alignments he identified as significant in his journals. This pattern suggests not random hallucinations or misidentifications, but a phenomenon that follows its own internal logic, a logic first glimpsed by Pembroke and perhaps fully understood by Abigail Whitmore during those 21 days of her first disappearance. The Whitmore case represents one of those rare instances where the documented facts suggest possibilities that rational science is reluctant to consider. What happened to Abigail Whitmore during those 21 days of her first disappearance? What did she discover in Pembroke's papers that so profoundly affected her? And perhaps most importantly, if Dr. Waite's final conclusions were correct, was the woman who returned to Millfield truly Abigail Whitmore at all? These questions touch on fundamental aspects of reality and consciousness that science is still struggling to comprehend more than a century later. The parallels between Pembroke's theories and modern concepts in quantum physics suggest that he may have been perceiving, however imperfectly, genuine aspects of reality that were beyond the scientific understanding of his time. If so, then Abigail Whitmore may have experienced something for which we still lack an adequate vocabulary, a genuine encounter with what Pembroke called adjacent realities, or what modern physicists might term parallel universes or alternate dimensions. The physical evidence associated with the case, the inexplicable cold, the electrical anomalies, the effects on timepieces and reflective surfaces, hints at interactions between different states of physical reality, interactions that conventional science cannot yet explain but cannot entirely dismiss. The answers may lie in the spaces between what we perceive and what exists, in that thin boundary between the known and the unknown that Pembroke sought to traverse and that Abigail Whitmore, whether by choice or chance, may have crossed. The house on Maple Street was demolished in 1968 after standing vacant for decades. During the demolition, workers reported unusual cold spots and electrical malfunctions in their equipment. One worker, in a statement to the local newspaper, claimed to have seen a woman standing in an upstairs window of the house moments before the wall was torn down, though photographs taken at the scene show no such figure. More significant was the discovery made during the excavation of the foundation, a small metal box containing what appeared to be a journal, its pages filled with Abigail's handwriting. The journal was severely damaged by moisture and time, with only fragments of text remaining legible. These fragments, preserved through careful restoration efforts, contain descriptions of what Abigail termed the other side, a place similar to our world but subtly different, where the laws of physics as we understand them did not consistently apply. She described entities that existed there, beings that were neither malevolent nor benevolent, but simply other, whose perception and understanding were so fundamentally different from human consciousness that communication was possible only through abstract mathematics and geometrical concepts. Most disturbing is her suggestion that these entities had become aware of our reality through Pembroke's experiments, and that they were curious about the nature of our existence in ways that might not consider our continued integrity necessary. In the sealed records of Miskatonic University, there is a single sheet of paper said to be from Abigail's journal, recovered from her home after her final disappearance. The text, written in what handwriting experts confirm is Abigail's, reads, "I understand now what Pembroke was trying to tell us. Reality is not fixed but fluid. Consciousness shapes it, defines it, creates boundaries where none truly exist. I have seen beyond those boundaries. They have seen me in return. The exchange has been made. The door is open now, and it cannot be closed. Puiste." This cryptic statement has been interpreted in various ways by researchers who have studied the case. Some suggest that Abigail experienced a profound psychological break, interpreting her subjective experiences through the framework of Pembroke's theories. Others propose that she genuinely perceived aspects of reality beyond normal human awareness, whether through some neurological peculiarity or through the influence of Pembroke's experimental methods. A few, including Dr. Pritchard in his later, unpublished writings, have suggested a more disturbing possibility, that what returned to Millfield was not entirely Abigail Whitmore, that her consciousness had been altered or partially replaced by something from the other side, something that perceived and interacted with our reality in ways that appeared inexplicable or impossible from our perspective. The land where Millfield once stood is now largely abandoned, the town having slowly declined after the textile mill closed in the 1950s. Few structures remain, and fewer still remember the events of that winter in 1914. Yet even today, visitors to the area occasionally report unusual phenomena: unexplained temperature drops, watches that stop for exactly 3 minutes and 33 seconds, the distant sound of a woman's voice calling from empty buildings. Most dismiss these experiences as the power of suggestion, the influence of local legends on susceptible minds. Yet the consistency of these reports, often from individuals with no prior knowledge of the Whitmore case, suggests something more persistent than mere folklore. Some researchers have proposed that certain locations, like the site of Abigail's former home, may possess unique properties that affect human perception or that interact with consciousness in ways we do not yet understand. Others suggest that events of sufficient intensity may leave an imprint on a place that sensitive individuals can perceive long afterward. A few following Pembroke's theories and Abigail's cryptic statements propose that these phenomena represent ongoing interactions between our reality and something else, something that continues to observe us through the door that Pembroke opened and that cannot now be closed. Science has yet to provide satisfactory explanations for what occurred in Millfield. Psychological theories of mass hysteria fail to account for the documented physical effects. Environmental explanations cannot explain the specific patterns of the phenomena. And the advanced mathematical concepts expressed by a small-town librarian with no formal training in higher physics remain an anomaly that has never been adequately addressed. The Whitmore case stands as a challenge to conventional understanding, a documented instance where reality as we comprehend it seemed to bend or break according to rules we cannot fully articulate. Perhaps this is why the case continues to fascinate and disturb those who study it, because it suggests that our perception of reality is incomplete, that there may be aspects of existence beyond our current comprehension, and that, under certain conditions, those aspects may intrude upon our world with consequences we cannot predict or control. Perhaps some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but simply remembered and respected. The boundaries between what we know and what we do not know are perhaps thinner than we believe. The case of Abigail Whitmore stands as a reminder that reality itself may be more fluid, more permeable than our limited perception allows us to comprehend. In the winter darkness of Millfield in 1914, something fundamental about our understanding of the world was challenged. Whether that challenge was answered or ignored may depend not on the facts of the case, but on our willingness to consider possibilities beyond our comfortable definitions of reality. As Dr. Pritchard wrote in the conclusion to his monograph, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Whitmore case is not what it reveals about the nature of reality, but what it suggests about the limitations of human perception. If Pembroke and Whitmore glimpsed something beyond the boundaries of conventional understanding, how many other aspects of existence might lie just beyond our awareness, separated from us by nothing more than the structures of our own consciousness? And if those boundaries can be crossed, what might cross them in return? As for Abigail Whitmore herself, no trace of her was ever officially found after that night in March 1914. Her legal status remained missing until 1921, when she was declared legally dead. Yet the reports of sightings persist, spanning decades with remarkable consistency. Always a woman in white, always unaged, always near locations connected to Pembroke's work or to Millfield itself. Always watching, as if waiting for something or someone to cross over. In 1968, during the demolition of her former home, a locket was found embedded in the plaster of a wall, a location where no jewelry could reasonably have been placed during normal construction. The locket contained a small photograph of Abigail and a lock of hair that DNA analysis in the 1990s confirmed was hers. Inscribed inside the locket were the words, "Between what was and what will be. How the locket came to be sealed within the wall, or what message it was intended to convey, remains one of the many unanswered questions surrounding the case. In the archive room of the Boston Society for Psychical Research, there is a file containing all known documentation of the Whitmore case. The file includes a note added in 1967 by Dr. Margaret Holloway, then the Society's lead researcher. After 50 years of investigation into the Whitmore incident, I am left with the unsettling conclusion that we may never fully understand what transpired. The evidence suggests a fundamental challenge to our understanding of consciousness and reality that science is not yet equipped to address. Perhaps most disturbing is the possibility that whatever began in Millfield in 1914 has not ended, but continues to unfold in ways we have yet to perceive. Dr. Holloway's note reflects the enduring mystery of the case, not merely what happened to Abigail Whitmore, but what her experience might reveal about the nature of reality itself. If Pembroke's theories were correct, if consciousness can indeed interact with and potentially traverse the boundaries between different states of reality, then the implications extend far beyond one woman's disappearance in a small New England town. They suggest a universe more complex, more fluid, and perhaps more dangerous than our conventional understanding allows. The small cemetery in what was once Millfield contains a memorial stone for Abigail Whitmore, erected by the town council in 1921. It bears only her name, the dates 1882-1914, and a single line from the poet Emily Dickinson: "The brain is wider than the sky." Local residents report that on certain nights, particularly during the winter months, the stone feels warm to the touch even when surrounded by snow. Some claim to have seen a woman in white standing beside it, though she vanishes when approached. The present caretaker of the cemetery, when asked about these reports, simply shrugs and says, "Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed." This simple statement perhaps captures the lasting significance of the Whitmore case. The suggestion that reality is not fixed and impermeable, but potentially as malleable and fluid as Pembroke theorized, that boundaries exist not as absolute divisions, but as permeable membranes that can, under certain conditions, be traversed. What lies beyond those boundaries and what might come through them remains a question that science has yet to answer definitively. Perhaps that is the final lesson of the Whitmore case, a reminder that our understanding of reality is limited by our perception, and that there may be aspects of existence that lie just beyond the boundaries of what we can comprehend. In the silence of a New England winter night, in the spaces between what we know and what we fear, the story of Abigail Whitmore continues to resonate. A whisper from that thin boundary between the possible and the impossible, between the world as we perceive it and the world as it might truly be. And in that whisper, a question remains. Are there others like Abigail Whitmore, individuals who have glimpsed beyond the veil of conventional reality? And if so, what might they have seen looking back at them from the other side? The answers, like Abigail herself, remain elusive, present yet intangible, known yet unknowable, a shadow at the periphery of perception that vanishes when directly observed, but which we can never quite convince ourselves was not truly there. In the final analysis, the case of Abigail Whitmore offers no definitive answers, only unsettling possibilities. It stands as a documented instance where the boundaries of conventional reality seem to waver, where the solid ground of scientific understanding gave way to something more fluid and uncertain. Perhaps that is why it continues to fascinate and disturb those who study it, because it challenges our fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence itself. In a universe that modern physics tells us is stranger and more complex than our everyday perception suggests, the experiences of a small-town librarian in 1914 may offer a glimpse of realities we are only beginning to understand. As we continue to explore the frontiers of quantum physics and consciousness studies, perhaps we will eventually develop frameworks that can explain what happened in Millfield during that winter. Until then, the case remains a compelling reminder that reality may be vaster and more mysterious than our limited perception allows us to comprehend, and that some doors, once opened, may indeed never truly close.